The senior senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've come to the floor today to introduce on behalf of 34 senators the Job Protection Act. The Job Protection Act is occasioned by a decision of the Acting General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board to file a complaint to stop the Boeing Company from building airplanes at a non-union plant in South Carolina, suggesting that a unionized American company cannot expand its operations into one of 22 states with a right-to-work law. A right-to-work law protects a worker's right to join or not to join a union. For example, in Tennessee, in the case, we're a right-to-work state, in the case of a Saturn employee, where the United Auto Workers is the bargaining agent, a worker at the Saturn plant doesn't have to join the union or even to pay dues, but he does have to accept, or she, the UAW as its bargaining agent. Or at the Nissan plant, which is a few miles away from the General Motors plant, the workers there have 3 times elected not to have a union as a bargaining agent. So that's what a right-to-work state is. There are 22 of them. And the state of New Hampshire is in the process of deciding whether to become the 23rd. The legislature's of one view, the governor's of a different view, and we'll soon know what the result is. The Job Protection Act that I introduced today on behalf of 34 United States senators would preserve the federal law's current protection of state right-to-work laws in the National Labor Relations Act and provide necessary clarity to prevent the NLRB from moving forward in their case against Boeing or attempting a similar strategy against other companies. Specifically, the Job Protection Act would first explicitly clarify that the board can't order an employer to relocate jobs from one location to another. 2, it guarantees an employer the right to decide where to do business within the United States. And 3, protects an employer's free speech regarding the costs associated with having a unionized workforce without fear of such communication being used as evidence in an anti-union discrimination suit. I ask unanimous consent to include in the record at this point the legislation, the Job Protection Act, the names of the 34 United States senators who are original co-sponsors of the Job Protection Act. And at the end of my remarks, Mr. President, I ask that we include 2 articles from the Wall Street Journal. The president of the Boeing Company, Jim McNerney, who's also chairman of President Obama's Export Council.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, to make a few remarks about the actions that have caused this. I've just left a hearing in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on the middle class in America. And one of the witnesses there was the general counsel of the Boeing Company. And as might be expected, given the notoriety of this case and the breathtaking scope of it, he got a lot of the questions. Let me first say why there's such a breathtaking scope here. Up until the filing of the complaint, one would assume that a manufacturing company, such as Boeing, or a smaller company, who wanted to open a new plant to create new jobs could make its own decision about where to do that. And that in doing so, it could take into account such factors as the cost of labor. It could take into account such factors as the labor relations within a state, as well as the geographical location of the state, and many other factors. But the reason the decision by the Acting General Counsel has attracted so much attention is it basically says, or at least it suggests, to any company manufacturing a product in a state which is not a right-to-work state, such as Washington, that you'd better think twice before you open a new production line in one of the right-to-work states. Now, let me talk for a moment about why that has an impact upon the middle class in America. 30 years ago, I was governor of Tennessee. We were the 3rd poorest state. My goal was to raise family incomes or to create an environment in which they could be raised. I knew enough to know, I was a young governor, but I knew enough to know that the government didn't raise the incomes, but it might create a good environment for that. I went to my first White House dinner with the President of the United States. The President was then Jimmy Carter. The President said to us governors, very nice dinner, just the governors and their spouses, the President and Mrs. Carter, governors, go to Japan. Persuade them to make in the United States what they sell in the United States. I remember I called Dean Rusk, who'd been the Secretary of State, and asked him to come visit with me and talk to him about how to do this. And off I went to Japan, which was not something I'd really planned to do when I was walking across Tennessee trying to be the governor. I met with the Nissan officials in Tokyo in the fall of 1979. At that time, the Japanese companies, which seemed so powerful that there were books coming out saying Japan #1, we thought they might take over the United States economy, but they weren't making here what they sold here. They were making Nissan cars and trucks in Japan. But they were making the decision about where to locate in our country. I took with me a photograph of the United States at night, taken from a satellite. And they asked, where's Tennessee? I said, it's right in the middle of the lights. That reduced the shipping and transportation costs. And then the next decision was, where in the center did they want to go? Every state north of us did not have a right-to-work law. Tennessee and the states around us did. Nissan chose Tennessee. And they and the General Motors plant that later came and the Volkswagen plant and thousands of suppliers have helped our middle class raise their incomes over the last 30 years. A third of our jobs are auto manufacturing jobs because we provided an environment in which automakers could compete in the world marketplace. And Nissan says today that soon they'll be making in the United States 85% of what they sell in the United States, which makes them a very American company. That's what we want. But this decision, Madam President, says would throw a big wet blanket over all the auto suppliers and manufacturers who might be thinking about moving into Tennessee or opening new plants in Tennessee, or suppliers who might be wishing to follow Boeing to South Carolina, because it says you can't make that decision. We've never had that kind of law in the United States. We've had a right-to-work law in the books since 1947. States have a right to adopt it or not to adopt it. And the legislation I'm offering today on behalf of 34 senators doesn't change that. But it does preserve the right of states to adopt a right-to-work law, the right of employees to join or not to join a union, and the right of employers to make decisions about where to locate their plants or their ability to speak in public about what they're doing. This is a most consequential decision. It is one that deserves the attention of every senator, because as the Boeing chairman, who is the head of President Obama's Export Council, wrote in the Wall Street Journal this week, that a union state would not be able to attract a manufacturer because a manufacturer might be afraid that any expansion could never be done in a right-to-work state. And by simple mathematics, if Boeing, which is our largest exporter, 155,000 employees in the United States, 15,000 around the world, has a disincentive, or if it can't expand a new production line in a right-to-work state, and if it might think twice about expanding in any other state, then where's it going to go? It's going to go to some other country. So this decision by the acting general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board is the single most important action I have seen in years that would rush American jobs overseas in pursuit of an environment in which they can build and manufacture competitively. It is just the reverse of what President Carter said to the governors 30 years ago when he said, governors, go to Japan, persuade them to make here what they sell here. We did that. They came here. They're making 85% of what they sell here. We want Volkswagen to do that. We want General Motors to do that. We want Ford to do that. And we want Boeing to do that. And if we say to them, but we're going to tell you, the federal government is going to tell you where you have to locate your plants, you're going to override Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act, which was passed in 1947 and which has created an environment which has really permitted American manufacturing to succeed. All one has to do is to read David Halberstam's book, The Reckoning, in the late 1980s, to see that if our entire auto industry were still locked into Detroit, that it wouldn't be as competitive as it is today. Cars made in America. I know that firsthand because I saw it happen when Nissan came to Tennessee. They didn't hire a bunch of people from Japan to run the plant. They went to Detroit. They got Ford executives who knew how to run a plant but weren't allowed to by the environment there, and they put them at a start-from-scratch place, and they created the most efficient automobile plant in North America. And we welcome also the General Motors plant and the United Auto Workers to their Spring Hill location in Tennessee. That's what a right-to-work state is. It's where you can choose to join the union or not to join the union. Both can operate. Employees make the decision. But when the federal government starts telling any company, a Boeing or a Boeing supplier or an auto company or an auto supplier, any manufacturing company, you can't locate in a right-to-work state, they probably won't locate in a non-right-to-work state. Where are they likely to go? Mexico, Europe, Japan. Boeing sells airplanes all around the world. It can make airplanes all around the world. And if we persist in policies like this, instead of having a situation where our largest exporter has 170,000 employees, more than 150,000 of which are in the United States, we'll turn that right upside down. And they'll be making 85% of their airplanes in the companies where they sell them, and the United States will have a lot fewer jobs. So this is an inconsequential matter that I hope attracts Democratic as well as Republican support. It preserves the right-to-work law. It preserves the choices of employees. It preserves the decision of corporations to make their own decisions about where to locate. And it would stop a federal government regulation, which is the single most effective action I know about to chase American jobs overseas and lower family incomes. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have 11 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that Carol Bruce and Brian Solars with the Senate Ethics Committee be allowed privileges of the Senate floor during today's session.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to support the Close Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act and to talk about the devastating effect that high prices at the pump are having on families in my home state of Washington. Madam President, middle-class families and small business owners are still struggling. You know, our economy is just starting to turn around, but so many families are still fighting just to stay in their homes, and so many small business owners are still struggling to keep their doors open, and so many workers are still desperately trying to get back on the job. And all of this is happening while we are here debating in Congress about the best ways to cut spending responsibly and rein in the deficit. This is a serious issue. We need to get it done. But I feel very strongly that before we make budget cuts that slash support for our middle-class families, we should look at ways to responsibly reduce the deficit that doesn't hurt the families that are struggling the most. And to me, one of the most common sense actions we can take is to end the wasteful subsidies that we, the taxpayers, are forced to hand over to the big oil companies every year. It's a no-brainer. Anyone who's serious about reducing the deficit should support this effort. It really is as simple as that. The big oil companies are already making billions of dollars in profits from families in America who are paying now sky-high prices at the pump. In fact, the 5 biggest oil companies have made nearly $1 trillion in profits, $1 trillion in profits in the last decade, and $36 billion just in the first 3 months of this year alone. But the big oil companies aren't just making money hand over fist from families paying sky-high prices at the pump. They also have the gall to come back to those same taxpayers and demand billions more in subsidies that add directly to their profits. It doesn't make any sense, and it has to end. So I think my colleagues here in the Senate who oppose this legislation need to explain to the American people why they think big oil companies need even bigger profits and why they think American taxpayers should continue to pad their coffers with unwarranted subsidies at the very time we are fighting to rein in the deficit. But, Madam President, in addition to ending those wasteful subsidies to the big oil companies, we also have to act to end the speculation that is a big part of what's pushing prices at the pump higher and higher. You know, at a time when our household budgets are already stretched so thin, speculators continue to drive up those prices and the volatility in the oil markets. That's why one of the reasons I was so angry and disappointed that the House Republicans' budget proposal slashed the funding for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. That is the very agency that is charged with protecting consumers from excessive speculation in the markets. How can they do their job and protect consumers if they're not there? So I think that says a lot about our very different priorities here in Congress. The House majority has pushed to slash spending by crippling agencies that middle-class families depend on for basic protections, while Democrats are here trying to reduce the deficit responsibly by ending subsidies for the big oil companies that don't need them. So I urge our colleagues to put taxpayers and the middle class ahead of big oil, to end those wasteful giveaways to oil companies, and to use that money to pay down the deficit in a responsible way. And I really want to thank Senators Menendez and McCaskill, Tester and Brown for their great work on this issue. So once again, Madam President, I support the Close Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act, and I'm going to keep fighting to end the oil and gas speculation that is hurting so many families in my home state of Washington and across the country. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank the Senator from Washington State for her leadership on this issue and for her eloquent remarks just now, as well as other senators who have championed this cause, as I have, over years when we have fought rising gasoline prices in the state of Connecticut relentlessly and tirelessly, and now rise here in support of legislation, the Close the Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act, which would fundamentally restore fairness to our markets and tax system. Over the last decade, the big 5 oil companies have taken home about $1 trillion in profits while enjoying tens of billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies and giveaways and sweetheart deals and preferences, which undermine the credibility of our tax system and our economy in the eyes of ordinary Americans. Ordinary Americans, in fact, are still struggling to make ends meet, to stay in their homes, to keep their families together, to find jobs. And in Connecticut, the price of gasoline now has risen to more than $4.25 a gallon from about $3 just a year ago. There are a number of ways to combat that spiraling cost of gasoline, including going after some of the illegal manipulation and speculation that may be occurring. I propose some measures, for example, a Department of Justice investigation that would, for the first time, effectively and comprehensively pursue the traders and hedge funds that are at an all-time high in their energy positions. But the ending of giveaways and subsidies is about the fairness of our economic system and our tax code. Our families and businesses in Connecticut are paying these higher costs of gasoline, but at the same time providing subsidies that are in no way needed for exploration or refining or any part of the business of these big five oil companies. They have made over $30 billion in profits in the first quarter of this year alone, representing a 50% increase in profit from the last year. Big oil doesn't need help from American taxpayers to make unprecedented profits. For better or worse, they know how to do it without corporate welfare. And we ought to end corporate welfare that makes our job of cutting the deficit and reining in the debt and reducing the size of government all the more difficult. This call ought to be an easy one. We have difficult choices ahead in cutting spending and perhaps increasing revenue. This one should be easy for us. And I hope that it will attract bipartisan support, because there is truly nothing partisan about this kind of corporate welfare. Despite claims to the contrary, ending these subsidies will not increase prices at the pump. It will impose basic fairness, because Americans will no longer pay out of our pockets for these tax breaks and giveaways to some of the most profitable companies in the world, but it will not add to prices at the pump. In my home state of Connecticut and across the country, people are rightly concerned about reducing our debt and deficit, and we will make those difficult choices, just as Americans are making difficult choices in tightening their belts and their budget as they struggle to find jobs and make ends meet. But as resources remain scarce for some of our most vital programs, we can ill afford this kind of corporate welfare. And I urge my colleagues to seize this moment, cut these subsidies, protect the hard-earned dollars of American taxpayers, taxpayers in Connecticut and throughout the country who basically want fairness, shared sacrifice, truly shared sacrifice. And I urge my colleagues to demonstrate to the American people that we are serious about tackling unfair giveaways and to take this step toward restoring fairness. Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from Ohio.
Hey, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I just met in a room right near the Senate floor with doctors and others from 3 of America's great children's hospitals, the Rainbow Children's in Cleveland, Nationwide Children's in Columbus, and Cincinnati Children's. And these Ohio, I think, leads the nation in the number of children's hospitals, and frankly, I think the quality of children's hospitals. And there are so many things we need to do. I know the presiding officer from North Carolina sits on the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committees, had an interest in this, where we don't quite focus enough on children's health. When we do research in this country, we used to, we're only beginning to change this, we used to think about children as just small adults, and if you need X milligram of prescription for a 150-pound adult, for a 30-pound children, you just give them 1/5 as much, or her 1/5 as much. And we realize that's not the way that we should do research or practice medicine. So we've seen a lot of progress. And much of that comes from the activism, if you will, of doctors and nurses and administrators at Columbus Nationwide Children's and Cincinnati Children's and Rainbow Children's in Cleveland, affiliated with University Hospital. But we've been able, through a long-time program, about a dozen years, something called Children's Graduate Medical Education, in training pediatricians. We've also seen it in making pharmaceuticals, something called 340B, getting pharmaceuticals available, particularly for orphan drugs and rare diseases, to children's hospitals, helping many, many small children in this country. And we're also working on legislation that Kit Bond, the Republican from Missouri who retired in January, gave legislation he and I have worked on to really focus on pediatric research and designate a handful, maybe 15, maybe 20 hospitals, children's hospitals around the country, some of the best research hospitals, to get them more focused on children's research, because even though we have done better, we're not doing well enough, and this is an opportunity to do that. I just wanted to share on the floor with colleagues the importance of this legislation, the importance of that focus on children's hospital, the importance of training pediatricians, and the importance of children's hospitals overall in our nation's health, especially the future of our nation, our children. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, everybody knows that this country faces a major deficit crisis, and we have a national debt of over $14 trillion. What has not been widely discussed, however, is how we got into this situation in the first place. A huge deficit and huge national debt did not happen by accident, did not happen overnight. It happened, in fact, as a result of a number of policy decisions made in recent years and votes that were cast right here on the floor of the Senate and in the House. Let's never forget, as we talk about the deficit situation, that in the year 2000, when President Clinton left office, this country had an annual federal budget surplus. Let me underline that, surplus of over $200 billion, with projected budget surpluses as far as the eye could see. That was when Clinton left office. What's happened in the ensuing years? How do we go from huge projected surpluses into horrendous debt? The answer, frankly, is not complicated. The CBO has documented it. There was an interesting article on the front page of the Washington Post on April 30th, a few weeks ago, talking about it as well. Here's what happened. Not complicated. When you spend over $1 trillion on wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you forget to pay for those wars, you run up a deficit. When you provide over $700 billion in tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, and you forget to pay for those tax breaks, you run up a deficit. When you pass a Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the drug companies and the insurance companies that does not allow Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices and ends up costing us far more than it should, $400 billion over a 10-year period, and you don't pay for that, you run up the deficit. If you more than double military spending since 1997, excluding the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you don't pay for that, you drive up the deficit. Now, yesterday, my good friend, and he is a good friend from Alabama, Senator Jeff Sessions, came to the floor and he suggested that Senator Bernie Sanders was one of those big government types. Well, I would say to my friend Senator Sessions and all of those others who are now wanting to make savage cuts in programs for working families, the elderly, the sick, and the poor, guess what? I'm the deficit hawk. You guys are the big spenders. This senator, when he was in the House, did not vote for the war in Iraq, which will end up costing us some $3 trillion by the time we take care of our last veteran. I didn't vote for that. Senator Sessions did vote for that. I didn't vote for the huge tax breaks for the richest people in this country. No, no. I'm the deficit hawk. My Republican friends, in every instance, voted for those huge tax breaks. I didn't vote for the Medicare prescription drug program, $400 billion over 10 years. I'm the deficit hawk. The big spenders on the other side said that we could spend that money and not pay for it. So my point is that I am not sympathetic to being lectured about deficits by the same people who caused this crisis and who, on piece of legislation after legislation, voted to significantly increase the deficit and forgot about paying for it. Just put it on the credit cards for our children and grandchildren. So please don't lecture me on deficit spending. Now, my Republican friends have come up with an interesting idea as to how we can deal with this crisis, with the deficit crisis. And in the House of Representatives, they voted, I believe unanimously, for the so-called Ryan budget. And what they said is that at a time when the middle class is collapsing, poverty is increasing, unemployment is sky high as a result of this terrible recession, what they think is that the best way to deal with the deficit of the national debt is to make savage cuts in health care, that is, to do away with Medicare as we know it today, converted into a voucher program, massive cuts in Medicaid, so at a time when 50 million Americans have no health insurance, that number will go up, and I'm not quite sure what you do if you get sick and you lose your health insurance. I don't know what you do. I don't know how many more people will die if you slash Medicaid and throw millions and millions of people off of that program. Their brilliant idea as to how you move to a deficit reduction is to make major cuts in education, Pell Grants, all over this country, middle-class, working-class families struggling to being able to send their kids to college. Pell Grants are an important part of how they can do it. Cut it. Large numbers of young people never get the chance then to go to college. Nutrition, cutting back on food stamps. Women, infant, children's nutrition program. People in America are hungry. Cut back on those programs. Housing, cut back on those programs. Head Start, giving low-income kids an opportunity to do well. Cut back on those programs. Child care, you name it, they're going to cut back on it. So the deficit is caused by unpaid-for wars, tax breaks for the rich, Medicare Part D prescription drug program, bailout of Wall Street, a declining economy, less revenue coming in. Their solution is Let us balance the budget on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the children, the poor. Let's cut back on environmental protection. Let's cut back on transportation. It's an interesting idea. I think it's a pretty dumb idea myself. But inherent in that whole approach is another factor. Madam President, in the United States today, while the middle class is disappearing and poverty is increasing, there is another economic reality. And that is that the wealthiest people in this country have never had it so good. Over a recent 25-year period, from 1980 to 2005, 80% of all new income went to the top 1%. Top 1% now earn 23% of all income in America, more than the bottom 50%. Today, Madam President, if you can believe it, the top 400 individuals in America now own more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans, bottom half of America. 400 people own more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans. Now, interestingly enough, Madam President, at a time when the rich are becoming richer, when the effective tax rates for the wealthiest people at 16.6% are the lowest on record, at a time when the wealthiest people have received hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks, at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high and major corporations making billions of dollars pay nothing in taxes, my Republican colleagues, in their approach toward deficit reduction, do not ask the wealthiest people or the largest corporations to contribute 1 penny more for deficit reduction. Their idea of moving toward a balanced budget is to go after the middle class, working families, low-income people, but make sure that the millionaires and billionaires and largest corporations in this country, who are doing phenomenally well, that they don't have to participate in shared sacrifice. They are protected. This is the Robin Hood philosophy in reverse. This is taking from the poor and giving to the rich. Now, Madam President, many viewers may not believe me, and I ask them to check it out, that in the midst of all of this, huge deficit, huge national debt, the Republican proposal to slash programs that working families, middle-class people desperately need, in the middle of all this, our Republican friends have another brilliant idea. Let's give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the very wealthiest people in this country. Yeah, we're going to throw millions off of Medicaid. We're going to cut back on Pell Grants. We're going to make savage cuts in nutrition programs. And when we get all of those savings, that $1 trillion in savings, you know what we're going to do with it? We're going to give it to the richest people in this country. We're going to lower the tax rate, personal income tax rate for the rich from 35 to 25%, at a time when major corporations like General Electric, ExxonMobil make billions of dollars in profit, pay nothing in federal income taxes. You know what we're going to do to them? We're going to give them even more tax breaks. Now, Madam President, the President has recently come up with an approach toward deficit reduction, which is certainly a lot better than the Republican approach, but to my mind is by no means as strong as it should be. And I was disturbed, not happy to hear that his approach calls for $2 in spending cuts and only $1 in additional revenue. So at a time of significant, severe recession, millions of people are hurting. The President is calling for $2 in cuts in spending, only $1 in additional revenue. I think that that's a bad idea. I think that's an inadequate idea. Because if the President starts at that position, $2 in spending cuts, $1 in revenue, by the time you deal with the Republicans in the House, that number's going to go up. It'll probably end up 3-4 to 1 in terms of spending cuts. Senator Ken Conrad, chairman of the Budget Committee here in the Senate, has done a better job, has not gone anywhere near as far as I think he should go, but has at least come up with a budget that I think most Americans think is sensible in saying, at the very least, let's have $1 of spending cuts and $1 of additional revenue. Let's at least have shared sacrifice. Let's not balance the budget on the backs of the weak and vulnerable. Madam President, let me just, my office put together just a list of ideas that are out there as to how we can raise revenue in a fair and progressive manner. And I want to just touch on them for a second. Number one, I want everybody to hear this. If we imposed a 5.4 surtax on millionaires who have been doing phenomenally well, over a 10-year period, we can raise $383 billion. Well, what do you think? We can throw millions of people off of Medicaid. We can end nutrition programs for low-income kids, or we can ask the wealthiest people to pay a little bit more. Madam President, the cause of this recession that we're in right now has to do with the greed, the recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street. The crooks on Wall Street who made huge sums of money ended up driving this country into a terrible recession. If we passed a speculation fee, a fee on Wall Street speculators, we could raise as much as $100 billion a year and, by the way, have the added benefit of cutting back on speculation. We could raise more than $580 billion over 10 years by ending tax breaks for companies that ship jobs overseas. Right now we have a tax policy that says, hey, shut down a plant in America, go to China, and guess what? You're going to get a tax break. I think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Madam President, the estate tax, which my Republican friends refer to as the so-called death tax, only applies to the top 0.3%, the very, very, very wealthiest people in this country. Instead of lowering the estate tax, as we recently did, we could raise $330 billion over 10 years by establishing a responsible estate tax that asks the top 0.3% of Americans who inherit over $3.5 million in wealth to pay a fair estate tax. Madam President, we could raise $736 billion over 10 years by taxing capital gains and dividends as ordinary income. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people in the world, has said that he pays a lower federal tax rate than his secretary, than do nurses and police officers and teachers, because most of his income and most of the income of very wealthy people is generated by capital gains. Our provision could correct that problem, taxing capital gains and dividends as ordinary income. Madam President, we could raise $40 billion over the next 10 years by ending tax breaks and subsidies for big oil and gas. And I do understand there is legislation going to be coming to the floor, which I strongly support. Doesn't go as far as I would go, but it basically says to the top 5 oil companies who have made huge billions and billions of dollars in profits, now charging us $4 a gallon. Prices are soaring despite the fact that supply today is greater than it was a year ago and demand is less, that maybe we do away with some of the tax breaks that they have enjoyed. $40 billion over 10 years is what I would propose that we can get. We could raise $100 billion a year by prohibiting abusive and illegal offshore tax shelters. Senate Budget Committee has a photograph of a building in the Cayman Islands. It's an infamous building. It's a 4-story building that houses 18,000 corporations. That's right. One building, 18,000 corporations. Obviously, the whole thing is a scam. This is just being used as a postal address for corporations and wealthy individuals who want to avoid paying taxes to the United States government. We estimate, the Budget Committee estimates that we're losing about $100 billion a year by having corporations and wealthy people stash their money in the Cayman Islands. Now, that's a lot of money, $100 billion a year. Madam President, we could raise up to $500 billion over 10 years by establishing a currency manipulation fee and, by the way, create up to 1 million new jobs in the process. So what is my point? My point, Madam President, is that this deficit was caused by actions voted upon by many of my Republican friends, the war, tax breaks for the rich, Medicare Part D, that in the middle of a recession, when the middle class and working families are already hurting, when poverty is increasing, it is not only immoral, it is bad economics to balance the budget on working families and the most vulnerable people in this country. When people are hurting, when they've lost their jobs, when their incomes are going down, you don't say to those people, we're throwing you off of Medicaid, we're going to voucherize Medicare, we're going to cut back on federal aid to education so your kid can't go to college. That's not what you say in a humane and fair society. On the other hand, at the same time when the wealthiest people are becoming phenomenally wealthier, and when large corporations are making huge profits, and in many cases not paying any taxes at all, it is appropriate to say to those people, sorry, you are also Americans. You have got to participate in shared sacrifice. You have also got to help us reduce the deficit. So that is where we are right now. We're in the midst of a major debate, but it's not only on financial issues. It is very much a philosophical debate. It's a debate about which side are you on. Do you continue to give tax breaks to the very rich and make savage cuts for working families, the children, the elderly, the poor, the most vulnerable? So, Madam President, I am going to continue doing everything that I can to make sure that the budget that is finally passed here in the Senate is a fair budget, is a responsible budget, is a just budget. With that, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New York.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to just